Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of the Passages Pulse. This episode is actually being done a little bit out of order and with a unique lineup. My name is Josiah McGee. I'm here today with a special guest who I'll introduce in a moment. We are recording this on Friday, November 21st, 2025. This episode will be released early next week, the week of Thanksgiving, but we won't be recording during the week of Thanksgiving to give both us and our audience a little bit of a break. We're also taking a step back from our usual conversations about current events to, I think, have a very interesting conversation that is a bit more high level. Take a step back and think about the issues in a more holistic manner. And in particular, we're going to be talking about something we don't normally talk that much about, which is American higher education as it relates to issues in the Middle East. Middle East Studies programs at a number of elite universities, if you're not very familiar with the subject, have come under fire in recent years for several reasons, prompting some interesting questions like, is it too late to save the field of study? Or is there still hope for it? Or is it simply lost at this point, something that should be given up on? We have a special guest, as I mentioned today, to help us think through some of these questions. His name is Johnnie Moore, an experienced leader with a very impressive resume. Won't read the entire thing, so I don't think we would have time to read the entire thing, and that would basically be the episode. But I'll give you a few highlights so our audience is familiar with him. And Johnnie, feel free to supplement with any additional context you'd like the audience to know about you. Johnnie previously served as the U.S. Commissioner for International Religious Freedom and is also an accomplished human rights activist, author, and organizational leader with experience in multiple fields, including Christian higher education at a couple of different institutions, Liberty University and Pepperdine being two of them in particular. He is also currently helping to build a new Master of Middle East Policy Studies program for Pepperdine University. Welcome, Johnnie. Thank you very much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure, Josiah. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you doing this. And for our listeners who were not privy to this bit of our experience, we had some technical issues. So especially thank you, Johnnie, to giving us some time to get that sorted out and being with us today. I'm very excited for this conversation. I have a bit of a background in Middle East studies. I did some undergrad work as well as graduate work at the University of London. So I know a little something about how interesting and politicized this field of study is and some of the dynamics that are going on there. But it's really quite interesting, and I think has gotten progressively worse over the last several years. Before we jump into that, I do want to just learn a little bit more about your perspective, because I think you have a very unique perspective to bring to this conversation. You've dedicated your career to many different causes, and I would just love to hear from your opinion and your perspective. Why is this something that Christians should care about in particular and study? How did you come to view this part of the world as something that you care deeply about, and why do you think it's important that Christians are well read on this part of the world?
Yeah, Josiah, I think a lot of Americans think that Christianity started somewhere in the Midwest. That Jesus maybe had a Southern accent and he, was American, but he wasn't. And our faith isn't a Western faith; it's a Middle Eastern faith. Everything that we cherish in our lives as Christians, I'm a religious Christian, or with the Jewish community, it all came from the Middle East. I mean, this is the ground in which it all gave birth to our values, to our history, to our shared and collective story. And so studying the Middle East is just profoundly meaningful if you come from a religious tradition like I do. It's also profoundly important in the world that we live in. The Middle East is the crossroads still of the East and the West, of the entire world. It is the economy, by the way, of just the Middle East. When you put Israel in, let's say Israel normalizes with all the Arab countries, is the size of the European Union. I mean, this is obviously from a religious perspective, from an economic perspective, when it comes to energy policy, when it comes to security. I mean, there is no part of our lives in our world that do not intersect with this region of the world. And so the problem with a field like Middle Eastern studies becoming so politicized and being used to promote all kinds of ideological agendas is we actually need to have a very objective view of this part of the world. And we need to be able to provide an objective education. So whether it's because you are connected to your faith, or you are concerned about national security or international security or peacemaking or energy policy or economics or whatever. I mean, somehow, the Middle East is a part of that.
It's something that I found really interesting in the headlines over the course of the last couple of weeks. Obviously, we've discussed some with our audience, the recent visits of leaders like Al-Jilani or MBS to the Oval Office. President Trump has been quite busy and his administration has been quite busy in the Middle East over the course of this year. And it's fascinating. He's come under some criticism even from his own base or those who used to be part of his base. I think Marjorie Taylor Greene was one recently, a bit of a public feud with him over whether or not he should be concerned primarily with foreign policy or domestic policy. And he basically made the argument that you can't separate the two. I mean, foreign policy does have a direct implication or direct impact on how well domestic policy works, which I thought was a bit interesting. Not something that I necessarily expected to hear from President Trump, that way of describing his approach or his perspective on the issues, but does, I think, get a little bit to the heart of what you're saying, that there are both theological reasons why, if you want to understand who you are as a Christian, you should know the history of the Middle East, but also some very practical geopolitical reasons why America more generally should care about or at least be informed about what's happening over there and the impact that it has on our own polity as well.
And just to put a fine point on that, Josiah, it just doesn't make any sense to have a conversation about the United States not being concerned about foreign policy. What are we talking about? I mean, this is an interconnected world. It is not, you're not a globalist or believe in the, international rules-based order or whatever, terminology, that's a certain side of the IO prefers, at the present moment or in previous moments. The Middle East and foreign policy period is integrated into your domestic policy inseparably. So we are either going to be involved or someone else is going to be determining our foreign policy for us. And those someone else's will be our adversaries. And so, one of the weird things about this isolationist sort of tendency that sort of suddenly popped up is that it just allegedly comes from some very smart people, but it's not actually smart at all. It's sort of nonsensical. And there's no coincidence that a lot of adversaries to the United States, and including hostile powers in nefarious and clandestine ways, are sort of putting fuel on this to divide the president's actually constituents and coalition, because they want the United States to have its foreign policy and security policy determined by other countries, because those other countries can use that to their advantage, either to diminish U.S. power or to increase their own. And so I just don't really get this. It's like there's a lot more going on here, and it's important for those of us who do pay attention to the Middle East actually to do a better job then of articulating why the region is important, why it matters. Even the relationship the United States has with Israel, the United States, its relationship with Israel is basically indispensable from a security and intelligence perspective. When it comes to the U.S. economy, the amount of technology technology originates in Israel that's integrated into our supply chain and everything that sort of holds our lives together. Aside from the fact it's the only democracy in the Middle East, which is not a small thing.
Yep. No, absolutely. I think that is something that I don't want to get too far off track on this tangent, but I think you're making a very good point that we don't have a very clear understanding of why we are interdependent in various ways. There's this interesting line of thinking, I think, that the U.S. is better off not being the world policeman, or that it would be arrogant of the U.S. to presume that it could be the world's policeman and whatnot. I think the flip side of that is that if you allow the pendulum to swing too far in the opposite direction, there is a bit of hubris or perhaps even arrogance behind this idea that you can completely withdraw and avoid any sort of consequences, or that you can so thoroughly insulate yourself from world events that you don't feel the impact of them. It's just not true. I mean, you're making good points there. I think are important for us to acknowledge and then think about, what are the realities, the facts about how interconnected the world is, like it or not. There are, I think, a few things that, unfortunately, you've made a good argument, I think, that it's important that we think about the rest of the world, not just ourselves, and the Middle East is important for obvious reasons. But I think what makes it challenging is a lot of people, I think, would recognize that and probably agree with you. There are a lot of reasons why people don't necessarily trust these sources of information that you would ordinarily be getting your information from, whether that is mainstream media. Obviously, there's a massive amount of alternative non-traditional media that's driving the conversation about the Middle East, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. When our elite universities are also caught up in that category, traditional sources of information or institutions people just don't trust very much right now are obviously, a wide variety of reasons why that is the case. But I'm curious to hear your opinion. Why? Where do you think these institutions, whether it is mainstream media or these universities, where do they go wrong? What is the core issue at the crux of this?
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to sort of understand the history of Middle East studies, where very early on, there were basically a few elite programs with a few elite professors training a few elite students in order to occupy certain, areas of expertise, whether that was in international business or in the intelligence community or in diplomacy or scholarship, professors producing professors. What happened about a generation ago, mainly because of oil and energy policy, all of a sudden these Middle East studies programs were flooded with foreign funding, and that foreign funding was often tied to ideological means. And so the thing about a university is if you can ideologically capture a university, you not only are potentially training more people to agree with you, whether or not they really substantively understand the subject matter, you're also capturing the credentialing process, right? So you're becoming the expert's expert. And we saw this happen. And not only did we see it happen, we watched it become almost ubiquitous, so that the top universities in the world became totally infiltrated with foreign funding connected to foreign ideological and political agendas. It kind of happened underneath the surface. You'd hear about weird things here and there, but for the most part happened underneath the surface. And then after October 7th, 2023, we saw this explosion at all of these universities all across America, where oftentimes the most insidious activities that were taking place, including on October 8th, 2023, were not only led by students in Middle East Studies program, but actually the faculties of some of those Middle East Studies programs. Some of these programs they've just been around too long and they're too hard to change. They're going to just be this. But what they aren't programs that value viewpoint diversity, for instance. They aren't programs that necessarily teach the subject matter objectively. They teach it almost exclusively through political lenses. And this has just become the status quo. And so, one of the things that when worked to establish this new Middle East Studies program at Pepperdine University in the School of Public Policy, which, by the way, Pepperdine School of Public Policy is one of the only schools of public policy that I'm aware of that just explicitly states on the website from the very beginning that one of our core values is viewpoint diversity. When we decided to create this program, we had a few things in mind with our program. And the first one is we'll take no foreign funding. Okay, none. So there's not a country that can write a check big enough to get us to take that check into this program. We certainly appreciate generosity because we need support for our students, support for the program, but we cannot be purchased by a sovereign government. That's not going to happen. It's a core part of this program. Number two, we decided that we wanted to indeed raise the funds, from others, not nation states, but from others, to scholarship the students in the program. So we can select the best and the brightest. In this cohort and in the next cohort, every student that gets admitted into our master's in Middle East Policy Studies gets a full tuition scholarship. And in between the 2 years of the program, this is the third thing, we want to take them to the regions. So we will take them, as part of the scholarship. We're going to take them to the region, multiple countries, meet the leaders of those countries, meet other actors in those countries, get on the ground, understand what's going on. And in the meantime, in the classroom, you're learning from practitioner scholars, right? Mm-hmm. Not people with all the academic credentials. Bernard Lewis, who's like the dean of Middle East Studies, the late professor, who's no longer with us, a revered figure in this field, basically one of the founders of the field. The students' first class in the program is from a professor who was mentored by Bernard Lewis. And throughout the entire course of the program, they learn from professors who both have their academic credentials, but also were and are practitioners in the field. Not people talking theoretically about intelligence or counterterrorism or the Middle East peace process or Iran or the history of Israel, but people who somehow participated in relevant either government positions or private sector positions that relate to it. And that seems like obvious, that you would not take foreign funding, that could ideologically skew a program, that you would actually take students overseas so they know boots on the ground, understand what they're doing, that their professors would be like practitioners and actually, not just knowledgeable about the field, but actually have experience themselves in the field, that we would, try to recruit the best and brightest on merit, as opposed to other things. And we'd be willing to, in effect, pay them tuition scholarships in order to participate in this program. But this happens almost nowhere. Okay. Almost nowhere. There's no other Middle East studies program. And it's an incredibly, incredibly courageous thing that Pepperdine did with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which is a partner of the program, to step into this chasm, this intellectual chasm, and to turn the light on and to start a new program based in the Washington, D.C. campus to train a new generation of leaders.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is a very powerful counter to what is the status quo. I mean, let's just take Bernard Lewis, for example. I think if you were to take a look at the average Middle East studies program, either in the US or in the UK, because I did, like I said, my work in the UK, I think what's fascinating is you're going to have a figure like Bernard Lewis who's criticized for a couple of reasons. One, for not following the more dominant theory of ideological framework of the day, which is going to be more consistent with Edward Said, for example. And two, for being a practitioner. I mean, one of the critiques of Bernard Lewis by many Said followers or acolytes is that Bernard Lewis was himself a practitioner who was perhaps complicit in various sins that he would be accused of because he actually practiced the field of foreign policy or in the Middle East. So it's very, very interesting. What you're describing is sounds like intentionally countercultural, or almost the exact opposite of what's happening, that you would not isolate a voice because they have practiced or because they are the subject of controversy, but rather elevate it and force students to grapple with different perspectives, including people who have actually had some experience on the ground. I do want to touch on that as well, because I think you also have some relevant experience on the ground, and I think might be able to add a bit of color to why that is a strength and not a weakness in someone who is teaching Middle East studies. My assumption is that there are certain street smarts, for lack of a better term, that you gain when you actually have some experience on the ground that you can't teach from a textbook, if that makes sense. I'm hoping you're going to tell me that I'm right, but maybe if you wouldn't mind to give me your opinion, is that your perspective? And for the audience, the context sake, I should back up a second. Johnnie worked for quite a while. It was at least several months helping to run the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which was a project to try to provide humanitarian aid in the Gaza Strip as a result of various humanitarian crises taking place there during the period of war following Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7, 2023. It was a relatively short run for the project, but I think a very impactful run for that project. Millions of meals given out to families in Gaza in order to combat the humanitarian crisis. So that's a bit of the background to why I'm asking you this question, Johnnie. But my question is two parts. One, am I correct in assuming that you can learn something doing that kind of work that you can't learn in the textbook? And if I am correct, if you wouldn't mind giving us a couple of examples of what are the kinds of things that you learn?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think you need both. I mean, you need scholars who wrestle with the text and wrestle with the history and expend all of their time and all of their energy in the language, the history, the text, and all of that. Like, you have to have that, but we have a lot of that. And what we have is we have far fewer examples where both that unique and acquired experience is coupled with the actual practical experience. And you're right. I mean, in my own case, like, I came to my PhD later on in life. I began as a practitioner, and that's part of my disposition. Actually, I'm a Christian, but from a Jewish mentor of mine long ago who told me, that if there's an issue I cared about, the best way is to just show up on the ground. Take your American passport, get on an airplane, go to that place, start meeting people, and figure it out. And that led me to, long before, working in Gaza, it led me to helping save Yazidis and Christians from ISIS in Iraq. It led me to creating basically internship programs for students in 50 countries around the world. It led me to help contribute to the people-to-people activity that preceded the Abraham Accords. It helped me to get in lots of big fights with lots of really bad guys around the world trying to protect religious minorities. And there's just something you only learn when you get in the trenches. And And one of the things about our degree program is it is about getting in the trenches. Yeah, we're producing scholars, but we're producing scholars that know how and that have the chops to actually make a difference in the world, and the type of people that want to get dirt underneath their fingernails and calluses on their hands. So for instance, when it comes to the history of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, the professor that will teach the students that class is Dennis Ross. So he was a personal eyewitness to at least half of these negotiations. And it's not to judge the efficacy of any of the negotiations. It's to present the facts, so that the students can come to their own conclusions and wrestle with these complex equations and personalities and the geopolitical circumstances surrounding him. But it's not someone bringing a 900-page textbook drawn simply from the documents, as important and as essential that it is. And there's a lot of this in the program. It's also sitting down and learning from someone who was in the room where it all happened. And I think we need both. We need scholars and we need practitioners. And sometimes we get scholar practitioners, that in venture capital, there's a concept of dual threat CEOs. So these are founders who also are CEOs, and because they have the skill of being a chief executive, but they also know what it is to found and to start something from scratch. And I think there's an equivalent in like a scholar practitioner, and that's definitely what we aim to train here. But you have to have languages. You're going to have to test out of a language at the end of the program. But what we discovered in our first cohort is our students in this first cohort, by the way, this is a Christian university that has as one of its key affirmation statements, it's the highest ranked Christian school, non-Catholic Christian school, Protestant Christian school. And as part of its affirmation statement, it says that truth, having nothing to fear from inquiry, is relentlessly pursued in every discipline. So it's our approach to everything across the board. But this is not a Christian university where all the students are Christian. In fact, a majority of the students in our first cohort of the Masters in Middle East Policy Studies program are Jewish. So it's majority Jewish and the rest Christian. A number of them, one of the students was accepted and deposited at Georgetown, chose to come and study here instead. There are a number of them that were at schools where anti-Semitic protests broke out over the course of the last 2 years when they were in their undergraduate programs, and they chose to come study, at our university. But when you come here and you study in this program, you're going to get both. You're going to get those scholars who know their stuff, and you're going to get practitioners who have been in the rooms where it happened. And among this class, not only will they add a language, but the students in this first cohort already brought with them Russian and Chinese and Farsi and all the European languages and Arabic and Hebrew. So it's a really, really competitive, unique, amazing program.
Sounds like it. I have to say, one of the things that I remember being so interesting about my experience when I was a student, I visited the region a couple of times, and it struck me how it seemed so much harder when I actually met people who were, walking these struggles out on a daily basis, trying to solve these conflicts or living these conflicts, people who lived in the region, that it was exponentially more difficult to solve the conflict than it seemed in the classroom. In the classroom, everything seems like it's very easy. It's a very simple equation. It's pretty abstract, but if you just, put the right pieces in place, surely we could solve these things and be home for dinner kind of thing.
Yeah.
The reality on the ground was that this is so much harder and more complex. And in part of that, I think, because it's just certain skills that you have to learn in the classroom, other skills that you can't learn in the classroom necessarily, types of psychology, for example, practical psychology, emotional intelligence, the ability to read a room, read people, to actually have a constructive conversation with someone, the ability to actually understand intuitively cultural differences or nuances and navigate those in a conversational setting. I mean, you really do have to have some immersive experience in order to gain those kinds of skill sets.
Yeah, Josiah, I say when it comes to the Middle East, there's a lot of IQ, there's a lot of EQ. A lot of people lead with their emotions. There are a lot of people that lead with what they think they understand. There's so little RQ, which is the reality quotient. Like, what is and the reality looks you're exactly right. I mean, it very often looks very different from the classroom or from the news or your social media feed than actually being on the ground. And so, like, one of the things we try to do, in fact, it just happened earlier this week, we do a lot of scenarios with the students. So, like, we did a mock National Security Council meeting earlier this week. The students were actually put in a scenario. Their professor is an expert on counterterrorism, and the students had to wrestle with it, and as if they were the decision makers. Like, what would they do? And these things are never easy. They always require value judgments, and there's a certain level of risk mixed in it. And so the goal is to give you enough knowledge, so that you know, what you must know. Maybe not everything you need to know, but what you must know. And then, get some empathy in what it is to wrestle with these things, and also go on the ground and see it for yourself.
I have one more question for you, Johnny, that I think might be a little bit provocative. So feel free to interpret the question however you will. And you may not have a ready answer to this question, but as I look at the state of things, I think it's very encouraging to hear about programs like Pepperdine's. I wish this was available when I was a student. I had wonderful experiences where I did go to school, surprisingly good experiences where I did go to school, but at the same time, I do wish this kind of program was around a few years ago. As I'm thinking about this, though, I'm trying to understand what kind of impact could a program like this have. And it's very early days of the program, so I understand this is kind of a hypothetical that we're discussing. But I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on and what sort of impact do you hope this program is going to have? Are you hoping primarily that it is an incubator that can prepare people to reclaim some of the academic space that has been lost, frankly, over the years to this sort of one-sided approach? Are you hoping that most of these people will be going into, practitioners' field and engaging in foreign policy, serving places like National Security Council, Department of State? What is the ideal contribution that you hope participants in this program are going to make 10, 20 years into the future?
Well, first of all, I happen to believe that Pepperdine is as fine a university as exists in the world, not just because of its academic bona fides, but because of its mission. And the university makes it very clear why it's here. It's to train graduates for lives of purpose, service, and leadership. And that last word of leadership is when people ask me, why did I do this? Why did I go back into higher education? And I left a lot of things in my life in order to come back into higher education at this phase of my life. And the answer I tell them is the same every time. I say, in all of my journeys all around the world, 100 countries and lots of conflict situations and profound poverty and, all over everywhere, I basically have determined that there's not a problem in the United States or abroad that ultimately isn't a leadership problem. We need more and better leaders. We need to prepare leaders. And so for me, that's what we're doing. We're preparing leaders. And whether those leaders decide to be scholars or to work in the intelligence community or to work for the Department of State or to advise Fortune 50 countries and their multinational relations, or to teach history in a primary school, or to become a lifelong student because of their interest, or to do peacemaking work, like a lot of what I've done. Whatever it is, whatever they do, if we can train leaders, they will do it well. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for leaders. We're looking for people. This is not an easy program. It's super intense. I mean, it's tough. It's a full-time program in Washington, D.C. You have the best professors you can imagine. Some of them are pretty tough. You're going to have to take language classes. This is not, this is not one of those programs where, when it's all said and done, you need a grade curve or something. This is old school. This is a rigorous, hard, life-changing experience. And we're looking for leaders, because what we have is we have a leadership deficit in the world. We have a leadership crisis in the world. And look, I don't think we can solve the whole problem. We're dropping the bucket. But, in this case, I'll quote a Jewish text, which is in Ethics of Our Fathers, where it says, "It's not up to us to complete the task, but neither are we free to desist from it." We can't solve the whole problem, but we can do our part. And the part that we can do is create the best, most incredible Middle East Studies program on the planet, master's degree program. And we can train a few generations of leaders that can make a difference in whatever field that they want to go into. And I should say, Josiah, that we're now taking applications for the next class, which begins in the fall of 2026. It's a 2-year program. The early decision deadline is December 15th, so people should get their applications in by December 15th. The late decision deadline is February 15th, and we want everyone that's interested in this program. And again, in at least in this next cohort, we'll see after that, but in this next 2-year program starting next fall 2026, everyone that's admitted into the program gets a full tuition scholarship.
Yeah, that's an incredible opportunity. To any of our listeners who have been listening on double speed, maybe hit pause, rewind, make sure you catch that. There is a full tuition scholarship for the next cohort available. If you apply, and you should do so quickly, lines are coming up for early decision applications on December 15. So just want to make sure we pause and make sure everyone caught that bit, because that's an important little nugget right there. But thank you so much, Johnnie, for joining us today. I think this has been encouraging for me. Sometimes looking back on my own experience as a student, I feel very fortunate that I was able to have the experience that I did, but I know it's not the case for so many students who are desperately looking for some answers and a good place to get good information on the Middle East to prepare for this life of service and leadership that you described. So it's encouraging to hear that there are people out there who agree and are trying to actually do something about that, and that Pepperdine is doing what sounds like very good work. So I appreciate you coming on today to share about it with us.
Thanks for having me. And I should say I appreciate all the work that you all do. I'm a big fan for a long time, and a lot of your alum are the type of people that we're looking for this program.
That's amazing. Hopefully there will be some of our listeners, who are going to be applying for those scholarships and taking advantage of this program. Thank you. I should say also to our audience, to you, the listeners, thank you for joining us today. I hope this conversation has been informative and encouraging for you as well. Also, of course, thank you to Lindsay, our producer, for helping us manage those tech issues at the beginning and produce this episode. Really appreciate you, Lindsay. And to everyone, hope that you have a wonderful rest of your week. Happy Thanksgiving, and thank you for joining us. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.